The arrival. Louise Evans had always been the kind of person who believed in the value of hard work. At 62, she had spent most of her life in service roles, quietly working behind the scenes to ensure the comfort and convenience of others. Her latest job, as a maid at the prestigious Regency Grand Hotel, was no different. While others might have been intimidated by the grandeur of the hotel's gilded ceilings and marble floors, Louise saw it simply as another place to earn an honest living. That morning, as the sun barely peeked over the skyline, Louise adjusted her red and white uniform in the small mirror of her modest apartment. She ran a comb through her short, graying hair and straightened the name tag pinned to her chest. Her hands, worn and calloused from years of scrubbing and polishing, moved with the steady precision of someone used to making the most of limited time. She grabbed her lunch, a simple sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and slipped it into her worn tote bag before heading to the bus stop. The ride to the hotel was always a reminder of the divide between her world and the one she served. The bus wove through working-class neighborhoods, past bustling markets and modest homes, before finally arriving in the heart of the city, where gleaming skyscrapers and luxury cars became the norm. The buzz of the hotel. The Regency Grand Hotel was a world unto itself, a symbol of opulence and excess. As Louise entered through the employee entrance, the familiar hum of activity greeted her. Bellhops wheeled luggage carts through the hallways. Chefs in crisp white uniforms shouted orders in the kitchen, and fellow maids rushed to stock their carts before the day's work began. "Morning, Louise," called Maria, a younger maid who worked on the lower floors. "Did you hear the buzz?" Louise shook her head as she tied her apron. "What buzz?" Maria leaned in conspiratorially, her eyes wide with excitement. "Conrad Hensley is checking in today. You know, the billionaire. The one who owns half the city." Louise blinked, unimpressed. "I don't follow all that. A guest is a guest, no matter how much money they have." Maria grinned. "You'll think differently if he tipped you a month's salary." Louise chuckled softly but said nothing. She had learned long ago not to expect much from the wealthy guests she served. To them, she was invisible, just another pair of hands cleaning up their messes. A foreboding introduction. As Louise wheeled her cleaning cart down the grand hallways, the murmur of excitement about Conrad Hensley grew louder. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about him. His ruthless business dealings, his sprawling mansions, his penchant for luxury. Louise tried to block out the chatter and focus on her tasks, but when she reached the top floor, her routine was interrupted. The elevator dinged, and out stepped a tall man flanked by a small entourage. Conrad Hensley's presence was unmistakable. His tailored suit clung perfectly to his broad frame, and his confident stride exuded the kind of authority that came from knowing the world bent to his will. His assistants scrambled behind him, carrying designer luggage and murmuring into Bluetooth earpieces. Louise instinctively moved to the side, hoping to go unnoticed, but Conrad's sharp eyes landed on her. He stopped in his tracks, and for a moment, Louise felt like a deer caught in the headlights. "You there?" he barked, his tone sharp and commanding. Louise stiffened. "Yes, sir." He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her uniform and her hands. "Make sure my suite is spotless. I don't want to find so much as a speck of dust." "Yes, sir," Louise replied, her voice steady despite the unease creeping up her spine. Conrad scoffed and continued down the hallway, his entourage trailing behind him. As he disappeared into his suite, Louise let out a slow breath. She had dealt with difficult guests before, but something about Conrad Hensley unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite explain. A warning from the manager. As Louise prepared to clean Conrad's suite, her manager, Mr. Perkins, appeared, looking flustered. His tie was askew, and his brow glistened with sweat. "Louise," he said in a low, urgent tone, "that's Conrad Hensley in there, one of the most important guests we've ever had. If he's unhappy with anything, it'll come back on me. And on you. Understood?" "Yes, Mr. Perkins," Louise replied, her stomach tightening. "And Louise," Perkins added, his voice dropping even lower. "Be careful. He's particular." Louise nodded, though the knot in her stomach grew tighter. She gathered her supplies and knocked on the door to Conrad's suite. A difficult encounter. "Enter," came a curt voice from inside. Louise pushed the door open and stepped into the sprawling suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, and the decor was a seamless blend of modern elegance and old-world charm. Conrad was seated in a leather armchair, his gaze fixed on a tablet. He barely glanced at Louise as she wheeled in her cart. "Your wine, sir," she said, placing the bottle and glass on a side table. Conrad finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as they swept over her. "How long have you been working here?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "Just a few weeks, sir," Louise replied, lowering her gaze. He chuckled, a humorless sound that made her skin crawl. "Let me guess. You've spent your life cleaning up after people like me." Louise's hands tightened around the handle of her cart, but she kept her voice even. "I've spent my life working hard, sir." Conrad smirked. "I'll bet you have." He gestured dismissively toward the door. "That'll be all." As Louise left the suite, her face burned with humiliation. She had dealt with rudeness before, but Conrad's condescension cut deeper than most. Still, she reminded herself that it was just another day, another guest. She couldn't afford to dwell on it. The weight of words. Later that evening, as Louise sat alone in the hotel's small staff break room, she replayed the encounter in her mind. Conrad's words lingered, not because they were the worst she had ever heard, but because they reminded her of the invisible barriers she faced every day. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how much pride she took in her job, there would always be people who saw her as less than. But Louise had long ago learned how to turn pain into strength. She straightened her shoulders and reminded herself why she was there: to do her job, to support herself, and to hold her head high no matter what. What she didn't know was that the next day would bring a confrontation that would shake both her and Conrad Hensley to their cores. A chaotic morning. The following morning at the Regency Grand Hotel began as it always did, with the hustle and bustle of staff preparing for the day ahead. Bellhops darted across the lobby, balancing suitcases with practiced ease, while the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the cafe. Louise arrived early, as usual, her footsteps steady despite the weariness that clung to her from the night before. She nodded at familiar faces, but kept to herself, her mind still preoccupied with the previous day's encounter with Conrad Hensley. After gathering her supplies from the storage room, Louise pushed her cart into the service elevator and ascended to the top floor. The day had barely started, yet she could already feel the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her. As the elevator doors opened, she was met with a peculiar sight: a cluster of employees whispering in hushed tones outside Conrad Hensley's suite. "What's going on?" Louise asked, her brow furrowing. Maria, the young maid from the previous day, turned to her with wide eyes. Apparently, Mr. Hensley threw a fit this morning. He called the front desk and demanded to see the manager, something about his room not meeting his standards. Louise's heart sank. She knew she had done her job thoroughly, but with someone as exacting as Conrad, even perfection might not have been enough. Before she could ask more, Mr. Perkins appeared, his face flushed with anxiety. "Louise," he called out, motioning her over. "I need you to handle this." "Me?" Louise replied, surprised. "Shouldn't the manager?" "I already spoke to him, but he insisted on speaking to the maid who cleaned his suite." Mr. Perkins interrupted, his voice low and urgent. "Please, just go in there and try to smooth things over. And whatever you do, don't escalate the situation." Taking a deep breath, Louise nodded. She adjusted her uniform and knocked softly on the door. A demanding presence. "Come in," Conrad's voice barked from inside. Louise opened the door to find him pacing the room, his tailored suit impeccable despite the early hour. The suite, as far as she could see, was immaculate. Every surface polished to a gleaming shine, every item in its place. Yet Conrad's expression was one of irritation, his brows furrowed as he gestured toward a small stain on the corner of the plush armchair. "Explain this," he demanded, pointing to the barely perceptible blemish. Louise stepped closer, inspecting the spot. It looked like a small drop of wine, no larger than a dime. She frowned, knowing it hadn't been there when she'd cleaned the room. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm not sure how this happened, but I can clean it immediately." Conrad scoffed, crossing his arms. "Unacceptable. I pay a fortune to stay here, and this is the level of service I get. Do you know who I am?" Louise straightened, meeting his gaze. "Yes, sir. You're Mr. Conrad Hensley, one of our most valued guests." He narrowed his eyes, clearly unsatisfied with her composed demeanor. "And yet, it seems your value doesn't extend to doing your job properly." Louise's cheeks burned, but she refused to let him see her falter. "I apologize, Mr. Hensley. I'll take care of this right away." As she worked to clean the stain, Conrad hovered nearby, his critical gaze never leaving her. He muttered under his breath about incompetence and standards, each word landing like a barb. Louise bit her tongue, focusing on the task at hand. She had endured worse in her years of service, but something about his dismissive tone stirred a quiet anger within her, a moment of dignity. When she finished, Louise stood and turned to Conrad, her hands clasped in front of her. "Is there anything else you'd like me to address, sir?" Conrad smirked, as if relishing her submission. "No, I suppose that will do. For now, just try not to mess up again." Louise nodded and began to wheel her cart toward the door, but as she reached for the handle, she paused. She turned back to Conrad, her voice steady but firm. "Sir, with all due respect, I take pride in my work. I've spent my life ensuring that the people I serve are comfortable and satisfied. I may not have your wealth or status, but I know the value of hard work and respect." For a moment, Conrad seemed taken aback, his smirk faltering. But the moment passed quickly, and he waved her off dismissively. "Spare me the lecture. Just do your job." Louise left the suite without another word, her heart pounding. She knew she had taken a risk speaking up, but she couldn't ignore the way he had belittled her. As she returned to the service elevator, she reminded herself that her worth wasn't determined by how others treated her. An unlikely encounter. Later that afternoon, as Louise was restocking supplies in the storage room, she overheard two employees talking near the doorway. "Did you hear about the charity gala Mr. Hensley is hosting tonight?" One of them said. "It's supposed to be a big deal. Millionaires and celebrities everywhere." "Yeah, but I heard he's only doing it for publicity," the other replied. "Apparently, his reputation has taken a hit lately." Louise didn't pay much attention to the gossip, but as the day wore on, she couldn't shake the tension that lingered from her encounter with Conrad. She threw herself into her work, cleaning room after room with meticulous care, but the memory of his condescension gnawed at her. By the time her shift ended, she was exhausted. She changed out of her uniform and left the hotel through the employee entrance, ready to head home and put the day behind her. But as she approached the bus stop, she noticed a commotion near the hotel's grand entrance. Curiosity got the better of her, and she lingered just long enough to see Conrad Hensley step out of a sleek black car, flanked by photographers and reporters. He was all smiles, waving to the crowd as if he were royalty. Louise shook her head and turned away, but not before noticing the stark contrast between the man she had met that morning and the persona he presented to the world. A quiet resolve. As Louise rode the bus home, she reflected on the events of the day. She had spent her entire life working hard, treating everyone she encountered with kindness and respect. Yet people like Conrad Hensley, who had every privilege imaginable, seemed to look down on others as if they were beneath them. But Louise refused to let his behavior define her. She reminded herself of the values that had carried her through decades of service: dignity, resilience, and the belief that everyone deserved to be treated with respect, regardless of their station in life. What she didn't know was that the events of the following day would bring her face to face with Conrad once again, in a way that would challenge both of them to see the world, and each other, differently. The VIP Gala and a revelation. The evening at the Regency Grand Hotel was unlike anything Louise had experienced in her short time working there. The grand ballroom, usually a quiet and polished space, was alive with energy. Crystal chandeliers cast shimmering light across the room, where guests dressed in the finest evening wear mingled with champagne flutes in hand. The hotel staff had been abuzz all day, preparing for Conrad Hensley's exclusive charity gala, a star-studded event meant to showcase his wealth and philanthropy. Louise had initially hoped her role in the gala would be minimal, confined to behind-the-scenes preparations, but her manager, Mr. Perkins, had other plans. As one of the most experienced staff members, she was assigned to assist the VIPs directly during the event. The thought of facing Conrad again made her stomach churn, but she pushed the feeling aside. It was just another part of the job. The ballroom's splendor. The ballroom was a masterpiece of opulence. Tables draped in silk linens were adorned with towering floral arrangements and gleaming gold accents. A live orchestra played soft, elegant melodies in the background, and servers in crisp uniforms moved swiftly through the crowd, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres and drinks. Louise moved among them, her posture upright and her expression calm despite the nervous energy coursing through her. She caught glimpses of the elite guests, famous actors, politicians, and CEOs, laughing and exchanging pleasantries. They barely noticed the staff weaving between them, and Louise preferred it that way. She focused on her tasks, ensuring glasses were full and plates were cleared, her practiced efficiency keeping her invisible. But as the night wore on, Louise couldn't help but notice Conrad Hensley at the center of it all. Dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, he exuded confidence, commanding attention with every word and gesture. He moved effortlessly between conversations, his charm on full display. It was hard to reconcile this polished version of Conrad with the man who had belittled her just hours earlier. An unexpected encounter. As Louise collected empty glasses near the back of the room, she overheard snippets of a conversation between two guests. "I heard Hensley's company has been under investigation," one man said, his voice low. "Wouldn't surprise me," the other replied. "Half these guys who throw charity galas are just trying to distract from their scandals." Louise frowned, her hands tightening around the tray she held. She wasn't one to eavesdrop, but the words stuck with her. Could it be that Conrad's seemingly perfect life wasn't as flawless as it appeared? Her thoughts were interrupted when she felt a hand on her shoulder. Turning, she found herself face to face with Maria, the young maid from earlier. Maria looked flustered, her cheeks flushed. "Louise, Mr. Perkins needs you in the kitchen," she said quickly. "He said it's urgent." Louise nodded, setting the tray down and making her way through the crowded ballroom. As she neared the kitchen doors, she saw Mr. Perkins pacing, his expression harried. "Louise, thank God," he said, rushing toward her. "We've got a situation. Mr. Hensley's personal suite needs to be cleaned immediately. He's expecting some important guests to join him after the gala, and it has to be perfect." Louise blinked, taken aback. "Right now? During the event?" "Yes, right now," Perkins replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're the only one I trust to handle this. Please just do it quickly and quietly." A moment of reflection. Louise gathered her supplies and took the service elevator up to the top floor. The quiet of the hallway was a stark contrast to the bustling ballroom below, and as she approached Conrad's suite, she felt a sense of déjà vu. She knocked softly, but there was no response. Taking a deep breath, she used her master key to unlock the door. The suite was in disarray. Empty glasses and plates littered the surfaces, and a faint smell of cigar smoke hung in the air. Louise set to work immediately, her movements swift and efficient. As she tidied the room, she couldn't help but notice small details: a stack of papers on the desk, a laptop left open, and a framed photograph on the nightstand. The photo caught her attention. It showed a younger Conrad standing next to an older man who bore a striking resemblance to him. Both were smiling, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. For a moment, Louise paused, studying the image. She wondered who the man was, a father, perhaps, or a mentor. It was hard to imagine Conrad as anything other than the cold, dismissive figure she had encountered earlier, but the photo hinted at a different side of him, one she hadn't seen, a hidden vulnerability. As Louise continued cleaning, her gaze fell on the open laptop. She wasn't one to pry, but a flashing notification on the screen caught her eye. It was an email, the subject line bold and urgent. SEC investigation. Immediate action required. Louise's breath caught in her throat. She didn't understand all the details, but it was clear the email wasn't good news. She quickly looked away, focusing on her work. It wasn't her place to involve herself in the affairs of the guests, no matter how curious she might be. Still, the glimpse of the email, combined with the overheard conversation in the ballroom, painted a picture of a man whose life might not be as perfect as it seemed. An unexpected guest. Just as Louise finished arranging the room to perfection, she heard a knock at the door. Frowning, she set down her supplies and opened it to find a woman standing there, a tall, elegant figure dressed in a sleek black gown. The woman's sharp eyes scanned Louise briefly before settling into a polite smile. "Is Mr. Hensley here?" she asked. Louise shook her head. "Not at the moment, ma'am. He's still at the gala." The woman nodded, her expression unreadable. "I'll wait inside." Louise hesitated but stepped aside, allowing the woman to enter. She watched as the guest walked over to the window, her posture poised and confident. There was something about her presence that felt significant, though Louise couldn't quite place it. "I'll leave you to it, then," Louise said, gathering her cart. "Thank you," the woman replied, her tone polite but distant. As Louise left the suite and made her way back to the service elevator, she couldn't shake the feeling that the night was far from over. There was an air of tension surrounding Conrad Hensley and his world, a tension that seemed ready to snap at any moment. What Louise didn't know was that the events of the evening would soon take a turn, one that would bring her and Conrad together in a way neither of them could have anticipated. The weight of secrets. Louise left Conrad Hensley's suite with her thoughts racing. The tension she'd felt while cleaning his room hadn't dissipated, and the unexpected guest in the black gown added an element of mystery she couldn't shake. Something about the way the woman carried herself, calm yet purposeful, made Louise uneasy. As she wheeled her cart back to the service elevator, she couldn't help but feel that this night would take an unexpected turn. A private moment in the service hallway. Back in the employee area, Louise leaned against the wall and let out a heavy sigh. Her mind wandered back to the email she glimpsed on Conrad's laptop. While it wasn't her business, the words SEC investigation kept echoing in her head. It explained a lot. His curt demeanor, the tension in his voice, and the way he seemed to mask his unease with arrogance. It was a stark reminder that even the wealthiest and most powerful weren't immune to struggle. As Louise stood there, Maria, the young maid, appeared at the other end of the hallway. She looked frazzled, her hair slightly out of place, as if she'd been running around all night. "Louise," Maria said, approaching quickly, "did you hear? Mr. Hensley left the gala early. I overheard Mr. Perkins talking. Apparently, something urgent came up." Louise frowned. "Left early. That's strange. His guest was waiting in his suite." Maria tilted her head. "Guest? Who?" Louise hesitated, not wanting to divulge too much. "A woman in a black gown." She didn't say much, just that she'd wait for him. Maria's eyes widened. "Do you think it's, personal?" Louise shook her head. "I don't know, and it's not our place to speculate. We just do our jobs." But even as she said the words, Louise couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her gut. Something wasn't adding up. Conrad's return. Later that evening, as the hotel quieted down, Louise found herself cleaning the hallway on the top floor. Most of the guests had retired to their rooms, and the usual buzz of activity had slowed to a crawl. She was about to head back to the employee area when she heard voices coming from Conrad's suite. The door was slightly ajar, and she caught a glimpse of him standing inside with the woman from earlier. Their conversation was hushed, but the urgency in their voices was clear. "This is spiraling out of control, Conrad," the woman said, her tone sharp. "The investigation isn't going away, and you can't keep pretending everything is fine." Conrad ran a hand through his hair, his usual composed demeanor cracking. "I know, Miranda, but I need more time. If I can just secure this next deal." Miranda cut him off. "Time isn't on your side. The gala tonight was supposed to reassure people, but all it did was raise more questions." Louise quickly moved away, not wanting to overhear more than she already had. It wasn't her place to eavesdrop, but the snippets of their conversation painted a picture of a man desperately trying to hold his world together. An unexpected assignment. Just as Louise reached the service elevator, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Mr. Perkins. "Louise, I need you to deliver an urgent package to Mr. Hensley's suite. It's at the front desk. Please handle this discreetly." Sighing, Louise made her way down to the lobby. At the front desk, she found a small, unassuming envelope waiting for her. The concierge handed it to her with a knowing look. "Whatever's in there, it's important." Mr. Perkins said it's confidential. Louise nodded, slipping the envelope into her apron pocket and heading back upstairs. When she arrived at Conrad's door, she knocked softly. The voices inside stopped abruptly, and after a moment, the door opened. Conrad stood there, his sharp features shadowed by the dim lighting of the suite. "Mr. Hensley," Louise said, holding out the envelope. "This was sent up for you." He took it without a word, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't the usual dismissive look she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, it was as if he were seeing her for the first time, not as a maid, but as a person. "Thank you," he said quietly, stepping back to close the door. An unexpected act of kindness. The night wore on, and Louise finally clocked out of her shift. As she waited at the bus stop in the chilly evening air, her thoughts drifted to Conrad. For all his flaws, there was something undeniably human about him. Something that reminded her that even the most outwardly privileged lives were often fraught with hidden battles. Lost in thought, she didn't notice the sleek black car pulling up beside her until the window rolled down. To her surprise, it was Conrad. "Louise," he said, leaning slightly out of the window. "Can I give you a ride home?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Sir, that's not necessary. I'm fine taking the bus." "Nonsense," he replied. "It's the least I can do after everything tonight." Reluctantly, Louise climbed into the car. The interior was as luxurious as she'd expected, but what surprised her was the silence that filled the space. Conrad didn't speak at first, his gaze fixed on the road. It wasn't until they were halfway to her apartment that he broke the silence. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low. "I was out of line this morning." Louise looked at him, startled. "Sir, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted, glancing at her briefly. "You've been nothing but professional, and I treated you poorly. I'm sorry." For a moment, Louise didn't know how to respond. She had spent years enduring mistreatment from people who never thought twice about her feelings. To hear an apology, especially from someone like Conrad, was unexpected. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice soft. A glimmer of change. When they reached her apartment, Conrad stopped the car and turned to her. "You probably think I'm just another entitled rich guy," he said, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Louise hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I think everyone has their struggles, sir. Some are just better at hiding them than others." He nodded, seeming to take her words to heart. "Good night, Louise, and thank you for everything." As she stepped out of the car and watched him drive away, Louise felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. She didn't know what the future held for Conrad Hensley, but for the first time, she saw a glimmer of the man he could become. If only he allowed himself to change. What she didn't know was that the events of the next day would bring their lives even closer together in ways neither of them could have imagined. The ripple effect. The next morning, Louise arrived at the Regency Grand Hotel to find the atmosphere noticeably tense. Staff members spoke in hushed tones, and there was an unusual buzz of activity near the manager's office. Louise clocked in and went about her usual tasks, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had happened overnight. The unexpected meeting. As Louise pushed her cleaning cart down the main hallway, she was stopped by Mr. Perkins, the hotel manager. He looked more frazzled than usual, his tie slightly askew and beads of sweat glistening on his brow. "Louise," he said, his voice a mix of urgency and exhaustion, "Mr. Hensley has specifically requested to see you in the conference room." Louise blinked, taken aback. "Me? Did he say why?" "No," Perkins replied, shaking his head. "But when someone like Mr. Hensley makes a request, we honor it. Just be professional and respectful. This could be important." Louise nodded, her stomach twisting with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. She parked her cart in the storage area and made her way to the conference room on the top floor. When she entered, she was surprised to find not only Conrad Hensley, but also the woman from the night before, Miranda, and another man in a suit who appeared to be a lawyer. Papers were spread out on the table, and the atmosphere in the room was heavy with tension. "Ah, Louise," Conrad said, looking up from the documents. His tone was softer than she expected, almost relieved. "Thank you for coming." Louise stood near the doorway, unsure of what to say. "Good morning, sir. How can I help?" Conrad gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. I need to discuss something with you." The proposal. Louise hesitated before taking the seat, feeling out of place in the room filled with wealth and authority. Conrad leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Last night," he began, "gave me a lot to think about. I've been living in a bubble, focusing solely on my wealth and reputation, and ignoring the impact I have on the people around me. You made me realize that." Louise blinked, unsure of how to respond. "Sir, I was just doing my job." "That's precisely the point," Conrad replied. "You were doing your job with dignity and professionalism, even after the way I treated you. I was unkind, and I see now how wrong I was." The lawyer next to him cleared his throat, sliding a document across the table. "Mr. Hensley has decided to establish a new initiative, a charitable foundation to support hotel staff, low-income workers, and others who often go unnoticed in their roles." Louise's eyes widened as she looked at the paper. "A foundation." Conrad nodded. "Yes, and I want you to be the face of it. Your story, your dedication, resilience, and grace represents exactly the kind of people this foundation is meant to support." Louise felt her heart race. "Me? Sir, I'm just a maid. I don't know anything about running a foundation." "You wouldn't have to run it," Miranda interjected, her voice warm. "But your involvement, your voice, would give it authenticity and purpose. You'd be helping to shape the direction it takes." The hesitation. Louise looked down at her hands, her mind swirling with doubt. She had spent her entire life working behind the scenes, invisible to the people she served. The idea of stepping into the spotlight, even for a cause as noble as this, felt overwhelming. "I don't know," she said finally. "This is a lot to take in." Conrad leaned forward, his gaze earnest. "I understand that, and I don't expect you to decide right away. But I want you to know that this isn't just about charity. It's about making amends. For me, for others like me, who have overlooked the people who keep our world running." Louise nodded slowly, her emotions a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "I'll think about it." The hotel's reaction. Word of Conrad's proposal spread quickly among the hotel staff. Some were supportive, praising Louise for her hard work and the recognition she was receiving. Others were less kind, whispering behind her back about favoritism and questioning why she had been chosen. Maria, the young maid who had befriended Louise, was one of the first to approach her. "Louise, this is incredible," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "You deserve this. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Louise smiled faintly. "It's just a lot. I never expected anything like this." Maria placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "You've earned it, Louise, and think about how many people you could help." A visit to the past. That evening, after her shift ended, Louise returned home to her modest apartment. She sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the document Conrad had given her. Memories of her years as a maid, a diner waitress, and a caregiver flooded her mind. She thought about the sacrifices she had made to support her family and the countless times she had been overlooked or dismissed. Reaching into a drawer, she pulled out an old photo album. Flipping through the pages, she stopped at a picture of herself in her 20s, standing outside the diner where she had worked for over 2 decades. Her younger self looked hopeful, full of dreams that had long since been set aside. Tears pricked her eyes as she realized that this opportunity, as daunting as it was, might be a chance to reclaim some of those dreams, not just for herself, but for others like her. A decision. The next morning, Louise arrived at the hotel earlier than usual. She went straight to Mr. Perkins' office and asked to be taken to Conrad. When she entered the suite, Conrad was seated at the dining table, sipping coffee and reviewing papers. "Louise," he said, standing up. "Good morning. Have you thought about my proposal?" She nodded, her expression resolute. "I have. And I've decided to accept." A smile broke across Conrad's face. "That's wonderful news." "But," Louise added, her tone firm, "if I'm going to do this, it has to be done right. This foundation can't just be about appearances. It has to truly help people." Conrad nodded. "Agreed. And with your guidance, I believe it can." As they shook hands, Louise felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, she wasn't just a maid or a background figure. She was a voice for change, and she was ready to make a difference. What neither of them realized was that this partnership would not only transform the lives of countless people, but also forge an unlikely bond between two individuals from vastly different worlds. The journey ahead would be challenging, but it was one they were both ready to face, together. A new chapter begins. Louise Evans had spent her life in the shadows, cleaning, organizing, and working tirelessly for others while rarely being noticed. But today, as she walked into the luxurious ballroom of the Regency Grand Hotel, all eyes were on her. The room was filled with hotel staff, media representatives, and influential figures from across the city. Louise stood at the threshold, her nerves jangling, as she prepared to step into the spotlight and accept a role she could never have imagined. The foundation unveiled. Conrad Hensley approached the podium, his usual polished confidence tinged with a humility that had grown over the past few days. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but sincere, "today marks the beginning of something extraordinary. The Louise Evans Foundation will honor the hard work and resilience of those who keep our world turning, people who often go unnoticed, but whose contributions are immeasurable." He paused, glancing at Louise, who stood near the stage. "And it's only fitting that this foundation is named after someone who embodies those qualities. Louise, will you please join me?" The room erupted in applause as Louise ascended the stage. Dressed in a simple yet elegant dress Maria had helped her choose, she looked every bit the dignified woman she was. Conrad extended a hand, guiding her to the microphone. Louise hesitated, taking a deep breath. She wasn't used to speaking in front of large groups, but she knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about everyone she represented. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I'm deeply honored and humbled by this foundation. For most of my life, I've worked behind the scenes, never expecting recognition or praise. But this isn't about me. This is about the countless others who work tirelessly in the background. Maids, janitors, kitchen staff, caregivers, people who are the backbone of our communities." Her gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Conrad, who nodded encouragingly. This foundation is a chance to give those people a voice, to show them they're seen and valued. I never thought I'd be in a position to make a difference, but thanks to Mr. Hensley's generosity, I believe we can. The applause that followed was thunderous, and for the first time in a long while, Louise felt truly seen. The backlash. While the foundation's announcement was met with overwhelming support, it also drew its share of criticism. In the days following the launch, online forums and social media buzzed with both praise and skepticism. Some comments celebrated the initiative. Finally, someone's acknowledging the unsung heroes. Others were less kind. This is just a PR stunt for Hensley to save his reputation. Conrad had anticipated the backlash, but it still stung. Sitting in his office, he scrolled through the comments, his jaw tightening. Miranda entered, holding a stack of documents. "You can't let the negativity get to you," she said, setting the papers down. "This is bigger than public opinion." Conrad sighed. "I know, but I also know that I need to back up my words with action." Miranda raised an eyebrow. "And you will. The first scholarships and grants are already being processed. Results speak louder than words." Meanwhile, Louise faced her own challenges. Some staff members at the hotel began treating her differently, some with newfound respect, others with envy or resentment. Maria remained her steadfast ally, encouraging her to stay focused on the bigger picture. A visit from the past. One evening, as Louise was preparing to leave the hotel, she noticed an older man waiting in the lobby. His weathered face and kind eyes seemed familiar, but it wasn't until he approached her that recognition dawned. "Mr. Jenkins," Louise said, her voice filled with surprise. It was her former boss from the diner, where she'd worked for over 2 decades. Mr. Jenkins had always been fair and kind, treating his employees like family. "I heard about the foundation," he said, his voice tinged with pride. "And I just had to come see you. Louise, this is incredible." Louise smiled, feeling a lump rise in her throat. "I never expected anything like this. It still feels surreal." Mr. Jenkins nodded. "You've always had a heart of gold, Louise. I'm glad the world is finally seeing what I've known all along." Their conversation reminded Louise of how far she'd come, and how much further she wanted to go. She wasn't just representing herself. She was carrying the hopes and dreams of so many others. A test of character. A week later, Conrad and Louise attended a board meeting for the foundation. Among the attendees were influential donors, business leaders, and activists. While most were supportive, one man, a corporate executive, voiced doubts. "Mr. Hensley," the man said, his tone skeptical, "how do we know this foundation isn't just a vanity project? What guarantees do we have that the funds will be used effectively?" Conrad opened his mouth to respond, but Louise spoke first. "Because I won't let it be anything less," she said firmly. All eyes turned to her. "I've spent my life working in roles where people like me were overlooked and undervalued. This foundation isn't about vanity. It's about justice, and I'll personally ensure that every penny goes to those who need it most." Her words left no room for doubt. Even the skeptical executive nodded, seemingly satisfied. After the meeting, Conrad pulled Louise aside. "You were incredible in there," he said. "I couldn't have said it better myself." Louise smiled. "I just spoke from the heart." A ripple effect. As the foundation gained momentum, its impact became increasingly apparent. Scholarships were awarded to children of hotel staff. Grants were provided to low-income workers seeking to further their education or start small businesses. The stories of those who benefited from the foundation began to spread, inspiring others to contribute. One day, Maria approached Louise with tears in her eyes. "Louise," she said, holding up a letter, "my younger brother got a scholarship through the foundation. He's going to college." Louise hugged her tightly, feeling the surge of pride. Moments like this made all the challenges worthwhile. A full circle moment. Months later, Louise found herself standing on the same stage where the foundation had been announced. This time, she wasn't nervous. She had grown into her role, finding strength and confidence she didn't know she possessed. As she addressed the audience, she reflected on her journey. When I started this job, I never imagined it would lead me here. But life has a way of surprising us. This foundation is proof that change is possible, that even the smallest voices can make a big difference. In the front row, Conrad watched with a smile, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, he felt like he was using his wealth and influence for something truly meaningful. A new legacy. As Louise stepped off the stage, she was greeted by applause and warm embraces. Conrad approached her, extending a hand. "You've done more for this foundation than I ever could," he said. "Thank you." Louise shook his hand, her eyes shining. "We've done this together." As they stood there, surrounded by the people whose lives they had touched, it was clear that this was only the beginning. The foundation wasn't just a project or a gesture. It was a legacy, one built on resilience, kindness, and the belief that everyone deserves to be seen and valued.